I want you to imagine that 1,000 years ago, there was a shoemaker in Constantinople, now that's modern-day Istanbul in Turkey, although at the time it was part of the Byzantine Empire. Imagine 1,000 years ago in Turkey, or in Constantinople rather, there was a shoemaker who sat down one day and decided to write a history of the world, something like the creation of the world, a story that his parents had told him, and that their parents had told them, and their parents had told them, going back to the point where they can't remember who started the story. And so he sat down and he wrote that out into a book. Put that aside. Then imagine, say, 100 years later, in northern Africa, say what would be modern-day Algeria. This is just an example. Let's say you had a teacher in North Africa who decided to write a history of a local tribe. Things that had happened over the generations of this tribe, the wars they'd had, the victories that they had won. He wrote that into a book and put that aside. Now, imagine 200 years later, say, a man living in what was at that point, or what is in modern-day southern France. Imagine that he, a soldier, was away from his wife for a long time, and so he wrote a series of love letters to his wife. Put those aside. Now imagine a few hundred years later, someone else, say a woman living on the island of Crete in the middle of the Mediterranean, woke up one day and felt compelled to write a long poem expressing this experience with God, this relationship with God. She couldn't put it into any other words, and so she wrote it down into a long poem. Now imagine, say, 50 years ago, we'll take a celebrity musician, say Bob Dylan. Not a big Bob Dylan fan, but let's just say Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan goes on a trip. He feels compelled to write a series of songs, song lyrics, that describe this mystery, the things that we've talked about these past few weeks. And then finally imagine that this morning, a young man in Philadelphia woke up and had a vision of the end of the world. And decided I should write this down. And so he sits down and he types it out on his Mac, of course. And then puts that aside. Now imagine that at some point later on, someone looks at all of these books, all of these writings, and even though they're written by different people, in different languages, in different parts of the world, over the course of 1,000 years, even with all of that, somehow they tell a cohesive, coherent story. That would be an amazing collection of books. We could call it a miraculous collection of books. Well, this is effectively what the Bible is. The Bible, it's not a single book. The Bible is not a book where you've got different chapters and you open it up and you can start reading from one and then finish on the last page. That's not what the Bible is. The Bible comes from the word biblia, which means books or library. It's a collection of books. And not only is it a collection of books, but it's a collection of different genres. It's kind of like if you've got history in there, of course, as with, say, Acts of the Apostles, which is the history of the early church, the very earliest actions of the apostles after Jesus rose and ascended into heaven. That's pretty straight history, and Luke even kind of describes it as such. But then imagine that you have something like Genesis. Well, Genesis is history of a sort, but it's not written in the same style as the Acts of the Apostles. You have broader, more visual language. We'll talk about why that is in just a second. But then you also have song lyrics. We talked about this celebrity songwriter, right? Bob Dylan. Well, Psalms, the book of Psalms. Those are song lyrics. Those are songs that David wrote. King David, that you could not at that period get to be more of a celebrity in that area than King David, right? But he, like everyone, how musicians, they always yearn to act, and actors always yearn to direct. Well, King David was this kind of Renaissance man, so he was the king, but he also was a great writer, he was a musician, all kinds of things. So you have song lyrics in the Bible. Then you have epic poetry. The Song of Songs is a great love poem, but more than that. So the Bible is a collection of all of these different genres of writing. But it isn't just that. There are many collections of writing, and there are some beautiful works of the ancient world. But the Bible is something different. Because even though it has all of those things, And even though the song lyrics are song lyrics, and the history books are history books, and the books of visions are books of visions, and the poems are poems, there's something more. They communicate a long-running story that starts at the beginning of the world and ends at the conclusion of the time. And so that's what we get to when we approach the Bible. And that's why it's so important to approach it in that way, knowing that this is not a single book written in a single way by a single writer. Not at all. It's diverse. And each book has to be written, or each book rather has to be read in accordance with the genre in which it is written, right? You don't read a song lyric the same way that you would read a math textbook, for example. And you don't read a textbook the same way that you would read a love letter from your spouse, right? I mean, this is obvious enough. Now, just in terms of strict practicality, the Bible is divided into two parts. They are not even parts. The first part, the first section is the Old Testament. The Old Testament is 46 books, and it is the vast majority of the Bible. The New Testament is only 27 books, and it's fairly small. The Old Testament was written over a period of, say, 800 years. Obviously, this is flexible. There are some sections that are much older than that, whereas the New Testament was written over a period of, say, maybe 40 to 60 years, depending on how you date the different books. The Old Testament, for the most part, was written in Hebrew. The New Testament, for the most part, was written in Greek, although there may have been actually some sections of possibly the Gospel of Matthew. It was written in Aramaic, which was kind of the language of ancient Palestine, basically. It's an offshoot of Hebrew. Now, here's an interesting thing. I mentioned that there are 73 books in the Bible. There are 46 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. That's the Catholic Bible. There are actually 7 fewer books in the Old Testament in the Protestant Bible. Now, why would this be? Well, there's actually a pretty good explanation for this. In the time of Jesus, there was no official canon or list of the Old Testament books. Some Jewish officials accepted these books, others rejected this book over here. Some didn't accept the Song of Solomon, others would reject wisdom, and so they would take different things at different times. And there was a translation of the Old Testament into Greek, because of course the vast majority of the Jews at that time, after they were dispersed away from the Holy Land, they lived in the Greek world. We talked about last week how, because of Alexander the Great, Alexander brought Greek learning and language to that entire region. So at that time, Greek was the common language of the people. It was the language of trade and commerce, and everyone spoke it to some degree, even though they had their own regional languages as well. But there was a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. It actually means 70. There was a legend, and this is not true, but it's a nice little story that 70 Hebrew scholars of the Hebrew Scriptures got together, and they were all also Greek experts, and they translated. They each kind of went off to their rooms, and they each translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and then they came back, and all of them were the same. You know, so that would be wonderful if only that were true. But that's why it's called the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint, this Greek translation of the Old Testament, contains all 46 books that the Catholics accept, that we accept as the Old Testament. But by the time of Jesus, most of the Jewish officials actually didn't accept the Septuagint. They would only accept books that were originally written in Hebrew. And there are 7 books in the Septuagint that were actually originally written in Greek. They don't have Hebrew originals. And so you can understand the Jewish officials were very conservative. They thought, look, God is speaking to us through our language, and so we're only going to accept those books that were written or inspired in our language. We're not going to accept these that were written in this pagan Greek tongue. And so they rejected those. However, when Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament quotes from the Old Testament, they are quoting from the Greek version of it. That's the version that they use. And there are some implications, there are some passages in Scripture in the New Testament where it seems that, like, if they are not quoting directly from the Greek version, they are at the very least alluding to stories that are only found in that. Now, it's nice to say that, okay, Catholics have got 46 books of the Old Testament, the Protestants have 39 books. What difference does it make? Well, I'm going to give you one one, I think, important difference. If you look at it, you don't have to, I'm going to read this out. The Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 12. This was written hundreds of years before Jesus was born. Hundreds of years. I'm going to read it. I'm going to skim over it, so I'm not reading it consistently. If you're reading along, you're going to be confused. All right. Again, this was written hundreds of years before Jesus. It says, this is a prophecy. Let us lie in wait for the righteous man, because he is inconvenient to us and opposes our actions. He professes to have knowledge of God and calls himself a child of the Lord. He calls the last end of the righteous happy and boasts that God is his Father. Let us see if his words are true, and let us test what will happen at the end of his life. For if the righteous man is God's son, he will help him and will deliver him from the hand of his adversaries. Let us test him with insults and torture, that we may find out how gentle he is, and make a trial of his forbearance. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for according to what he says, he will be protected. This prophecy was written hundreds of years before Jesus was born. This is about as clear a prophecy of Jesus as you could get in the Old Testament. But this book is not in the Protestant Old Testament. This is only in the Catholic Old Testament. Now that's, I would think, pretty significant. Because here is a very, very clear prophecy of Jesus as the Messiah in the Scriptures, hundreds of years before he was born. There's no trickery. It's not like, someone wrote it after he died and came back to life. This was written before. And it's a very clear prophecy. And we have it in our Bible. That's why this is an important thing. That's only one example. And there are others, but that is one. Now, when we say that the Bible is inspired by God, we do not mean that God somehow dictated it to the apostles as though they were sitting around, the writers of the Scriptures, whether it's the Old or the New Testament, were sitting around and God was speaking in their ear and they were just copying down what God told them to write. That is the view taken in Islam of the Quran. In Islamic theology, Muhammad, and I'm summarizing, Muhammad has an encounter with the angel Gabriel, who tells Muhammad, listen, and then recites the Quran. Muhammad, in the Islamic narrative, Muhammad is illiterate, so he memorizes what was said, and then later it's committed to writing in Arabic. And that's why really the only Quran that exists is in Arabic. Everything else is considered a translation of the Quran, but it is not itself the Quran. Why? Because God spoke Arabic. And he spoke what was written there. So when you're reading the Quran, according to Islamic theology, you are reading literally the words that God spoke to Muhammad. That is not the view that Christians take of the Bible. When Christians look at the Bible, we look at all of these different books, written at all of these different times by different writers for different reasons and in different genres. And we see that God spoke through each one of these people, using their own talents, using their own style, using language that they would have used, slang, using examples or imagery that would have been popular in the region at the time. And so for us, when we look at the Bible and we see maybe, a grammatical error, it's not a big deal because, of course, this is just the author is writing as he speaks. Now, in Islamic theology, of course, if you found a grammatical error in the Quran, as some allege that there are, I don't know any Arabic at all, so I have no idea, but that would be a real problem in Islamic theology because, of course, why would God make a grammatical error, right? But in the Bible, this is not an issue. So, if the Scripture is not dictated, if God didn't simply act as a kind of like someone reading off what he wants his secretary to write, then what is it? Well, it is God's message to us, written in all of these different languages. I mean, this is the glory of the universal nature of our faith. Because different people at different times, with different education levels, in very, very dramatically different life situations, were all used by God to add to this story, this narrative of God's truth throughout the ages. And so I think that there's a fittingness to it when we think of the Bible that way. Now, how do we interpret the Bible then? One of the big questions we always get is, so do we take the Bible literally? We interpret the Bible literally. Well, the answer is it depends. It depends entirely on what book you're talking about, or even on what section of the book you're talking about. If you look at one of Jesus' parables, let's say the parable of, we all know the parable of the prodigal son. I'm not going to repeat it, but we basically, a rich man has two sons. One is obedient, one is disobedient. Disobedient one runs off, spends the inheritance, comes back penniless, and then there's a dispute between the older brother and the father. So now we all know this story, and Jesus tells it as a parable. He's using it as an example to illustrate a truth. Now, do we take that literally? Was Jesus literally saying there was actually a God who this happened to? No, he wasn't. This is a parable. And if we understand Jesus to be speaking literally, if we're taking him literally in that story, then we're not understanding what he's saying. We're missing the point. If I tell you that at home, Zoe has told me a million times to hang up my clothes and not drape them on, literally on like every item of furniture in the house. She's told me millions of times. Do I really mean that Zoe has told me millions of times?
I think so. Sure.
Well, okay, I probably should say that. It's entirely possible that that's true.
Maybe not hundreds of millions.
Possibly not hundreds of millions. Okay. That's a bad example. But obviously, I'm not saying that Zoe has told me literally millions of times. It's a figure of speech. And if you understand me to be speaking literally, as if it was you were some kind of Dr. Spock comes in and says, how that doesn't compute, how that someone can do that millions of times. Well, you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. It doesn't mean that I'm lying. I'm not lying when I'm saying that Zoe told me millions of times, right? No, it's a figure of speech. So depending on the book that you're talking about, depending on the genre in which it is written, that's going to determine whether or not you take something literally. For example, the Gospel of Luke. Luke at the very beginning says that he assembled this Gospel after interviewing sources. I mean, he approached the Gospel of Luke as similar to a way that a modern day historian would approach a book of history. Right? And he did the same thing with Acts of the Apostles. Those are basically two books, a continuous narrative. But the Gospel of Matthew isn't written that way. The Gospel of Matthew, you have passages that show that Jesus is the Messiah kind of grouped together. Because for the ancient Jews, this is the way that you organize the material. See, for the ancient Jews, it would have been absolutely bizarre to write history like we would consider like a modern day reporter. As saying, okay, the table was exactly square and there was 15 people here, and just write the details. An ancient Jew would have said, well, what? You're talking about all the details, but you're missing the significance of what happened. I'll give you an example. Let's take two accounts of the story. On the one account, let's say this. In November 9th, 1989, a bunch of Germans knocked down an old wall in the city of Berlin. All right? It's true, right? It's literally true, right? Now, let's take that same story and retell it. Let's say that in the fullness of time, the angel of freedom descended upon the oppressed people of East Germany. Let's call it New Prussia. Fancy, right? New Prussia. The angel of freedom descended on the people of New Prussia and liberated them from their chains. And so the forces of good overcame the forces of tyranny and the people were free. Now, that's obviously a more exuberant, expressive, visual way of expressing or describing the same event, probably closer to some of the language of Scripture. And really, it better represents the significance of what happened, rather than saying, a bunch of Germans, after one evening had some beer and they went and knocked down an old wall in the city of Berlin. That may have been literally true, but it misses the whole point of the event. And so an ancient Jew would have looked at that and would have said, if you're just sticking to what was just literally what you were seeing with your eyes, you're missing what really happened. For an ancient Jew, you would not have been a good historian. You would not have been a faithful witness. And so we should not import our modern day categories of how to write history or how to represent an event or the significance of a happening back into the Bible and then somehow accuse them of being inaccurate or of being mythological or of fudging things. No. That's called a presentism. That's an actual fallacy in historical writing, and that's where you judge the past by the standards of the present. It's a fallacy of anachronism.
Plus, it depends on what side of the wall you're on.
Right, exactly, yes, exactly, because your perspective will change dramatically the way you see it. Exactly. So, how do we then interpret the Bible? Well, you interpret it according to the genre of the book that you're reading. So the way that you'll interpret the Gospel of Luke will be dramatically different than the way you would interpret, say, a prophetic writing, or something like the Apocalypse, which is very visual. It's rich with symbolism. John sees a beast rising out of the sea, and there's 7 heads, and there's diadems and things like that. He isn't literally saying there's going to be this monster with all these heads. The heads represent kingdoms or whatever it happens to be that he's expressing. So you have to understand a book in line with the genre in which it is written. Now, when the church approaches the Bible, we have two avenues to scriptural interpretation. On the one hand, for our own private prayer or our devotional reading, we can just pick up the Bible and read it. And God can speak to us through the Bible in different ways, and speak to us in the images that it gives us, or maybe even, if you've ever played Bible bingo, as I have, you just kind of, you just put your finger down and just meditate on whatever passage you happen to come down on. With me, it's always like Leviticus, like the jackals will slake their thirst on the blood of the But that's my luck. I don't know what God is telling me. When it comes to devotional reading, you can approach the Bible and interpret it in your own spiritual life according to the light and the Spirit that God gives you. But when it comes to doctrine, when it comes to the things about God that we learn, the truths that God reveals about himself to his people, these beliefs that all of us share, these beliefs that bring us together and define us and make us Catholic, these beliefs are not up to each individual to decide. These things ultimately are interpreted by the church, because the Bible was born out of the church. There was no New Testament canon. In other words, a list of New Testament books. The very earliest one was 393, the Council of Hippo in northern Africa. And that was followed in 397 in the Council of Carthage. These are all northern African councils. So you had 4 centuries, really you had 350 years before the New Testament canon was collected. Nicaea was 325. Yeah, it wasn't specifically about the Council of Nicaea wasn't about the canon of Scripture. Yeah, it had to do with Trinitarian issues, and specifically Arianism, which was a belief at the time that Jesus was not God, he was just a perfect man. Now, you raise a very good point, because obviously they had something. They weren't just like, gosh, I don't know what the New Testament is. It wasn't like that, but there were still books in dispute. So, say up until 393 or up until the late 4th century, you had a lot of agreement on some of the books, like the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Everyone agreed. These are part of the Bible. Romans, no question about that. But you did have some disagreement over the Revelation of John, otherwise known as the Apocalypse of John. You had some disagreements over Hebrews, letter to the Hebrews. So you had disagreements over certain books. Some people thought these were inspired, and some people didn't. And other people would add other books in there. Some people thought the Didache, which was written earlier than a lot of the New Testament, and is perfectly consistent with Christianity. That may have been written in the year 70. It's a very, very old book. Some people thought that was inspired. So, and some people thought the first letter of Clement, who was an elder in the Church of Rome, writing to Corinth. The church in Corinth, for generations, they were reading that letter during their Mass. So obviously they considered that scripture as well. So it was an ongoing process. But the authority who recognized what the New Testament was and what the Old Testament was the church. And so the church is the final arbiter when there's a disagreement over what a passage means when it comes to something like doctrine. Again, the beliefs that we hold as a people. And I'll give you an example of why that's so important. I've given you handouts, and I've stolen this example from Patrick Madrid, who's a friend and a very popular Catholic speaker, and also introduced to Zoe, so I owe him. She's still angry about it, but I disagree. I have a passage on there. I never said you stole my money. I never said you stole my money. We all understand this sentence, right? This is not a trick sentence. I never said you stole my money. Right? We all understand? Now, let me say that in a different way. And notice how every time I emphasize a different word, it changes the meaning of the sentence. How about this? I never said you stole my money. But Kathy did, right? Or I never said you stole my money, but I wrote in an email to Monsignor. Or I never said you stole my money, but Zoe did. Or I never said you stole my money, but you stole my car. See, notice every time you emphasize a different word, it changes dramatically the meaning of the sentence. And it helps if you were there in the room to hear how the sentence was said, to know what I mean by it. See, that's why we have the church. Because the church has existed from the very beginning. The church was there. The early Christians, not only in the scriptures, but the early bishops like Clement, like the right author of Didache, like whoever wrote the Shepherd of Hermas, like all of these people, Ignatius of Antioch. I mean, all of these people who were there in the very beginning, who were either witnesses to these events or knew the witnesses to these events, like Ignatius and John, or Irenaeus, who was in southern France later on. We understand the Bible in the way that they understood it because they were there. They can tell us how the sentence was said. I mean, this is one sentence. One sentence. All those meanings that I just pulled out of one single sentence. Now multiply that thousands of times when it comes to the Bible, and you start to see the conundrum, right? The puzzle. Now, at the time of the Reformation, there was a rival theory put forward to how to approach Scripture, or rather how to approach doctrine, how to form doctrine. That theory, or that position, was called sola scriptura, which means by Scripture alone. And the idea there is that every doctrine that a Christian must believe is contained explicitly enough in Scripture for the ordinary believer to find it there and understand it. And that sounds pretty good. I mean, that sounds good in theory. Seems that there's a certain sense to it. The problem, though, is that, well, it actually has three big problems. Number one, that belief that all truth that is required of the Christian is found in the Bible clearly enough for the ordinary believer to find it there and understand, that belief is not itself found anywhere in the Bible. So, problem number one, if you're claiming that all the truth that you need is right there, or the truth that's required to believe is there, and that belief itself is not there, then you have a self-refuting proposition. So it's unbiblical. The second thing is it's unhistorical. This was not a belief that was held until the 16th century. So you had a good 1,500 years of Christian history where no one would have thought that this idea that someone could just take the Bible and go off and kind of form, kind of come up with my own beliefs according to whatever I want to, say with the Bible. This is a relatively modern phenomenon. This is a 16th century thing. I mean, you can find it to some degree, maybe in the 1300s, 1400s, but for the most part, really, it's the 16th century. And then finally, the problem is that it's just, not only is it unbiblical and unhistorical, but it's unworkable. It's unworkable because of what I just showed you. Just one sentence. You see the problems with that, right? If we get 6 different people together trying to interpret one sentence, you're going to have 6 different views of that sentence. And you take the Bible. Well, gosh, you have 35,000 different Protestant denominations, each with their own interpretation of the Bible, and each claiming that their beliefs are as the Bible would teach them. Now, obviously, when we're talking about these different things, I'm giving you the Catholic view, obviously, right? We wouldn't be here, would we? Right? I don't mean to attack Protestantism at all, but I do need to show you where we differ. So I have enormous respect for Protestantism. I have a lot of respect for evangelicalism in particular. I owe it a great deal. But there is a point where I think that it falls short, and that's what I want to communicate. If that were not true, then there would be no reason for anyone to be here. So I want you to understand that when I contrast these beliefs, I'm not insulting Protestantism or Islam or any of these other religions at all. I'm just trying to contrast and show where a Catholic view would say, well, that doesn't touch it fully, and so this is our position. This is how we solve the problem that we see here. There's a lot of areas where, especially with Protestantism, I mean, 95% of what we believe together. And so that's great, but we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about what is distinctive about Catholicism so that you can understand it and make your own informed decision. So the Bible is a creation of the church. It was born out of the church. And when it comes to matters of belief, when there's a disagreement, the final arbiter is the church. It is in 1 Timothy 3:15. It's called the pillar and foundation of the truth. The very pillar and foundation of the truth. A pillar is something that holds something up on a foundation. For the building, it holds that up. So the church holds up the truth, whether it's in Scripture or whether it's in any other area of God's communication to us. So are there questions? I went all over.